He's an arch social reactionary who voted for the Conservative Party earlier this year. He's someone who in 2014 denounced correctly Nigel Farage for whipping up prejudice against Johnny Foreigner and then campaigned alongside him. He said, he campaigned for Remain like anyone with any brain cells, and then obviously was an arch Brexiteer. Said some pretty grim things about Donald Trump, which weren't exactly making clear his staunch opposition to the former president. And on these social issues, you can hear he sounds like Lawrence Fox. What I would say, and I do think this is important, is, look, I've personally interviewed, I'll get his name right. Yeah, interviewed Shakil Afsar myself, and I do think there needs to be some demarcation there, because this is a landlord property developer who's headed these anti-LGBTQ protests, which I made a documentary about 2 years ago in Birmingham, and he will opportunistically jump on anything essentially. But equally, Labour has their own questions to answer, because if you take, for example, back in 2019, Roger Goldsmith, the Labour MP he was a Birmingham MP, he backed the anti-LGBT protests. The NEC rightly withdrew support from him. The chief whip, Nick Brown at the time, backed the move, but some, including Tom Watson, spoke against having the whip withdrawn from him. And there are sections of the Labour right who clearly don't have who now run the party, don't exactly have an exemplary record. In fact, I should mention Shabana Mahmood, who is the national campaign coordinator of the Labour Party, who back in 2019, condemned her at the time, spoke about how the religious background of peoples and the age appropriateness of conversation should be taken into account when teaching RSE in relation to LGBTQ issues. Now, what George Galloway said, there's a pack of lies, incidentally. Education, inclusive education, as being taught in these schools, doesn't teach young children about sex, nothing about sex whatsoever, let alone being taught how to masturbate. These are grotesque lies. What you do is you have these books, for example, which show people with some children have mixed race parents, some have two mothers. That's literally the education that they're taught, and they're taught that's okay, that's fine. Families come in different shapes and sizes. These families exist. We should respect difference. That's all they're taught. That's correct. Obviously, people should support that. In terms of, though, and I suppose the caveat I would add, that's why, as I said, George Galloway is an arch reactionary and no progressive should ever support him, there will be a narrative that Muslim disillusionment is not being driven by legitimate concerns, namely issues like Palestine and Kashmir, namely their sense of Islamophobia not being dealt with within the Labour Party, their sense of being marginalised by the Labour leadership and the Labour Party not taking them for granted, but rather by homophobia and anti-Semitism. And that's simply just not true, because anyone who's been to Batley and Spen will testify that when they speak to local Muslim voters, that actually those issues are not being raised at all spontaneously ever. Issues like those I've just mentioned are. In fact, some have told me that the only incidents they've heard of voters making homophobic comments about Kim Leadbeater come from old white voters. Now, George Galloway actually in that speech may well be aiming at those kind of, Lawrence Fox types, I suppose, in Batley and Spen, but it would be a grave error to understand any significant problems the Labour Party suffered being as a result of being driven in any significant way by Muslim voters being homophobic and or anti-Semitic. That doesn't mean, as I've just done and you've done, George Galloway should not be explicitly condemned and explicitly opposed by people on the left. He's not our friend. He should be treated as an enemy. He's in league with profound reactionaries, and we shouldn't throw minorities under a bus, even if you think the Labour leadership deserves a punch in the nose. But nonetheless, that's the nuance, I suppose, that yes, this Birmingham anti-LGBT protester opportunistically jumps on any bandwagon to further his agenda. Yes, there is deeply reactionary elements of this charlatan, this demagogue, George Galloway. But that's not the primary reason that Labour are suffering in any sense in Batley and Spen. Muslim voters voted for Labour for years when Labour was introducing pro-LGBTQ policies. So that's clearly not the overriding concern whatsoever. It's the issues I've just raised. And
they also voted for Labour when they had a Jewish leader in the form of Ed Miliband. So these Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just saying, I mean, Ed Miliband actually is the only Labour leader to call himself a Zionist, and Muslim voters still overwhelmingly voted for him.